"You can have my card if you can read this," said the boss, but the cleaner surprised him. Richard Bennett had just finished another shouting match with his managers when he noticed her presence in the office. His business was thriving, but his arrogance grew in lockstep with the financial success he'd achieved by 32. The young woman in a green uniform kept dusting the shelves, paying no mind to his harsh words on the phone. Richard hung up and watched the cleaner for a few seconds, a mocking smile forming on his lips as a cruel idea crossed his mind. "Hey you," he called, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Come here a minute." Emily Parker looked up from the cloth she'd been using to wipe the glass desk. At 28, she carried burdens few could imagine just by seeing her there. Plain uniform in place, mop in hand. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," she replied, her voice respectful but steady. Richard pulled an elegant card from his pocket, admiring it with satisfaction before holding it out to her. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, waving the paper between his fingers. "It's my personal card. I only give it to special people. If you can read what's written here, it's yours. How about it?" The taunting tone was unmistakable. Emily knew this kind of provocation well. She'd faced similar situations before, but had always chosen silence as her answer. This time, something different flickered in her eyes. "May I see it?" she asked, holding out her free hand. Richard chuckled softly as he handed her the card, absolutely certain he'd witnessed yet another confirmation of his prejudiced beliefs about those he deemed beneath him. Emily held the paper carefully, her eyes tracing the words written in an elegant font. Silence stretched for a few seconds as Richard waited, already preparing the sarcastic remark he'd make. "Veritas et justitia fundamentum sunt societatis." Emily read aloud. "Truth and justice are the foundation of society." It's an adapted quote from Cicero, though he used iustitia in the plural in his original writings. Richard's smile vanished instantly. He blinked several times as if unable to process what he'd just heard. That was luck," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Anyone can memorize a Latin phrase these days. The internet's full of them." Emily handed the card back, but Richard didn't take it. His hands trembled slightly as he fished in his pocket for another slip of paper. "Fine then," he said, his voice higher than usual. "Let's see if you can handle this one." He pulled out a second card, this one inscribed in completely different characters. It was a keepsake from years ago, given to him by a Greek professor during a business trip, one he'd never understood. "Δικαιοσύνη και σοφία μεγίστη αρετή." Emily read without hesitation. Emily read, "Justice and wisdom are the greatest virtue. Though there's a slight conjugation error, it should be magiste arete, in the plural, since it refers to two virtues." Richard felt the world spin around him. Not only had she read ancient Greek flawlessly, but she'd also corrected a mistake he hadn't even known existed. Where did you learn that?" he asked, his arrogance giving way to genuine bewilderment. Emily picked up the mop again and resumed cleaning the desk, a faint smile on her lips. "Life teaches many things, Mr. Bennett," she replied, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. Richard stood there for several more minutes, watching her work in silence. When he finally left the office, he carried more questions than answers. In the days that followed, Richard couldn't get the scene out of his head. He began noticing Emily in a way he never had before. He observed that she always arrived 2 hours earlier than the official start time, but no one could explain why. "Why does she come so early?" he asked his secretary Jennifer over breakfast. "I don't know, Mr. Bennett," Jennifer replied without looking up from her papers, "but all the cleaning staff say she's different, always reading something during breaks." This only piqued Richard's curiosity further. He started discreetly observing Emily's habits, noticing details that had previously escaped him. During lunch, while other employees chatted or scrolled through their phones, Emily collected discarded newspapers from the offices. Richard was intrigued to see they weren't just in English, but also in Spanish and even French. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. One morning, Richard decided to arrive early at the office. He wanted to understand what Emily did during those 2 extra hours before the official workday began. What he discovered left him even more perplexed. She was in the company's small library, a space rarely used by employees, with several old reports spread across the table, taking notes in a simple notebook. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, unable to hide the irritation in his voice. Emily looked up calmly, unfazed by his presence. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she greeted. "I was researching some of the company's old contracts." Researching? A flicker of alarm shot through him. Why would a janitor be interested in company contracts? Emily closed the notebook slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "I found some irregularities in labor agreements from previous years," she said, her voice steady. "Contracts that specifically disadvantaged the cleaning staff." Richard's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what she was referring to. Years ago, when he took over his father's company, he had implemented cuts that mainly affected the benefits of maintenance workers. "You don't have authorization to handle these documents," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "This is an invasion of privacy." "The documents are in the company's public archives," Emily replied, standing up slowly. "And as an employee, I have the right to access information relevant to my work." Richard felt control slipping away. He'd never imagined a mere janitor could challenge him like this. "You're fired," he blurted out. Emily held his gaze for a long moment before responding. "I have job security due to my tenure, Mr. Bennett. I've worked here for over 5 years. Besides," she picked up a folder from the corner of the table, "I have copies of all the documents proving the irregularities. It would be interesting if the union were to see them." Richard felt the ground vanish beneath him. Not only could he not fire her, but she also held information that could cause serious trouble for him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice weaker than intended. "Justice," Emily replied simply, "and respect for the employees who keep this company running." In the following days, Richard began finding small notes in Latin scattered across his desk, simple messages that unsettled him deeply. "Humilitas vera sapientia est." Humility is true wisdom. "Qui alios judicat, se ipsum non noviti." He who judges others does not know himself. At first, Richard thought about ignoring the notes, but they started appearing more frequently. He decided to install discreet security cameras in his office to find out how Emily managed to get in there unseen. What the cameras revealed surprised him even more. Emily wasn't breaking into his office. The notes were left during regular cleaning hours, always when she was organizing the papers on his desk. But there was something else in the recordings that caught his attention. During breaks, Emily would meet with other cleaning staff and lower-level administrative employees. She was teaching them to read. Richard watched, fascinated, as she helped a middle-aged security guard decipher a simple text, and one of the kitchen assistants write her own name with more confidence. That discovery stirred mixed feelings in Richard. On one hand, he felt irritated by what he saw as interference in company matters. On the other, there was something about Emily's dedication that moved him in a way he couldn't explain. The situation came to a head during an important investor presentation. Richard was in the middle of explaining the company's numbers when he made a serious error in the financial calculations, one that could cost millions in investments. That's when Emily, who had been quietly cleaning at the back of the room, approached and whispered something in Jennifer's ear. The secretary hesitated for a moment before interrupting Richard. "Mr. Bennett," Jennifer said nervously, "I think there's a mistake in the third quarter numbers." Richard stopped speaking, annoyed by the interruption, but when he looked at the data on the screen, he realized he had indeed made a significant error, one that, if uncorrected, would have ruined the presentation. After fixing the numbers and successfully closing the deal with the investors, Richard called Jennifer aside. "How did you spot the mistake?" he asked. "It wasn't me," Jennifer admitted, clearly uncomfortable. "It was Emily. She noticed it and asked me to warn you." Richard felt a mix of gratitude and humiliation. A janitor had saved $1 million deal, something he, with all his higher education and experience, had nearly ruined. That night, Richard stayed late at the office, reflecting on recent events. As he was preparing to leave, he heard noises coming from the library. He found Emily organizing books and documents. "Do you always stay this late?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Only when there's extra work," she replied, without stopping her organizing. Richard stepped closer, eyeing the books she was handling, volumes on management, economics, and labor law. "Do you really understand all this?" he asked, genuinely curious. Emily stopped what she was doing and looked directly at him. "Yes, I do, Mr. Bennett. I was a classical literature professor at State University before things changed in my life." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had spent weeks trying to unravel the mystery of Emily, and now the truth was there, simple and devastating. "A university professor," he repeated, as if he couldn't process the information. "For 8 years," Emily confirmed. "I specialized in classical languages and ancient literature. I spoke 5 languages fluently and had started my PhD when—" She stopped abruptly, as if the words were too difficult to continue. "When what?" Richard pressed, his curiosity overriding any sense of privacy. Emily took a deep breath before answering. "When my husband got sick. Very sick. We spent all our savings trying to save him. I lost the house, the car, everything. After he was gone, I had to start over from scratch." Richard felt a lump in his throat. The woman he had treated with such disdain carried a story of loss and sacrifice he could never have imagined. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You never asked," Emily replied simply. "And even if you had, my past doesn't change who I am today. I'm a custodian and I do my job with dignity." Richard fell silent for a long moment, processing everything he had just learned. His pride, however, still fought against the humility beginning to stir within him. I'm sorry for your loss," he finally said. "But that doesn't change the fact that you've been tampering with confidential company documents." Emily met his gaze with a mix of disappointment and determination. "Mr. Bennett, those documents prove employees were wronged. People who worked here for years and were harmed by unfair administrative decisions. I can't stay silent about that." Richard felt defensiveness rise within him. Those cuts had been necessary to keep the company competitive. At least, that's how he justified his actions. "Look," he said, pulling out his wallet, "how much do you want to forget about those documents? $1,000? 5,000? 10,000? Emily's expression changed completely. For the first time since they'd met, Richard saw real anger in her eyes. "Do you really believe everything can be solved with money?" she asked, her voice trembling with indignation. "Everything has a price," Richard replied, trying to maintain his arrogant stance. "Dignity has no price, Mr. Bennett. Neither does justice." Emily picked up her bag and headed for the door, but stopped before leaving. "I have a different proposal for you," she said, turning back. "A literacy program for all the company's employees. Free classes during break time for anyone who wants to learn." Richard laughed sarcastically. "You're out of your mind if you think I'll spend money on that." "It won't cost the company anything," Emily replied calmly. "I'll teach the classes myself, voluntarily. I just need your permission to use a room during breaks." "And in return?" "In return, I'll keep those documents and not take them to the union." Richard considered the offer. It seemed too simple, almost suspicious. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Because I believe education can transform people," Emily answered. "And because deep down I think you can still change too." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard rejected the proposal the next day, but Emily didn't give up. She began working behind the scenes, quietly discussing the literacy program idea with other employees. 2 weeks later, Richard was surprised by a summons from the company's board of directors. When he arrived at the meeting, he found 3 of the 5 board members present, including his own mother, Mrs. Margaret, who still held significant shares in the company. "Richard," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice stern, "we've received an interesting proposal from one of our employees." Richard's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what this was about. "A custodian presented a literacy project for our employees," one of the board members, Mr. Thompson, continued, "with impressive data on how it could boost productivity and reduce workplace accidents." "Mom," Richard tried, This woman is trying to cause trouble for the company. She's been digging through old documents and she discovered that we've been paying unnecessary settlements for years on labor lawsuits that could have been avoided," interrupted Mrs. Margaret. "The data she presented shows that better educated employees make fewer mistakes and generate lower legal costs." Richard realized he'd been completely outmaneuvered by Emily. Not only had she circumvented his refusal, but she'd also won the board's support with solid arguments. "The program was approved unanimously," announced Mr. Thompson, "and the employee will be promoted to coordinate the company's educational activities." Richard left the meeting feeling defeated and humiliated. His authority had been publicly challenged, and by a janitor no less. His pride was wounded in a way he didn't know how to handle. In the following days, Richard watched Emily transform a rarely used meeting room into a small classroom. She brought her own materials, arranged makeshift desks, and created a welcoming space for employees who wanted to participate. The response was surprising. Over 20 employees signed up for the first classes, including people from various departments. Richard tried to ignore the program, but it was impossible not to notice its impact. Employees seemed more motivated. There were fewer errors in reports, and surprisingly, the overall atmosphere at the company had become more positive. It was during this time that something unexpected happened in his personal life. His 15-year-old son, Michael, was struggling severely in school. His grades had plummeted, and Richard had hired several tutors without success. One afternoon, Richard found Michael crying in the hallway of the building where the company was located. The boy was stepping out of the elevator with red eyes and the expression of someone who had lost all hope. "Michael, what are you doing here?" Richard asked, concerned. "Dad, I came to talk to that teacher who works here," the boy answered, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "What teacher?" "The lady who teaches the employees. The cleaning staff in our building said she's really good at teaching." I'm desperate, Dad. I don't understand anything at school." Richard felt a pang in his chest. His own son had sought help from Emily, the woman he had so disrespected. "And did she help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She said she needs your permission first," Michael replied. "But she was really kind to me. She said everyone can learn, they just need to find the right way." That night, Richard had a difficult conversation with his wife, Sarah. She was worried about Michael's school performance and didn't understand why Richard hesitated to accept help from someone who clearly knew how to teach. "Richard, you're letting your pride get in the way of our son's well-being," Sarah said, her words direct and painful. "If this woman can help Michael, why won't you let her?" "Because she's a cleaning employee," Richard answered, his words harsher than he intended. "So what?" Sarah shot back. "You told me yourself she was a university professor. What's the problem?" Richard didn't know how to respond. He couldn't even explain to himself why he was so resistant to accepting Emily's help. The next day, with great reluctance, Richard authorized Emily to tutor Michael. The sessions would be held twice a week after school at the company. Michael's transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, his grades began to improve, and more importantly, he regained his confidence. Richard discreetly observed the lessons and was impressed by Emily's patience and teaching skill. "How does she manage to do what so many expensive private tutors couldn't?" Richard asked Sarah after yet another successful session. "Maybe because she genuinely cares," Sarah replied, "and maybe because she understands what it means to need a second chance." His wife's words echoed in Richard's mind. For the first time, he began seriously questioning his own attitudes and prejudices. The change in Michael hadn't gone unnoticed by the other employees. The news that Teacher Emily had helped the boss's son spread quickly, further increasing everyone's respect for her. Richard realized he was losing authority. The employees now respected Emily more than they did him. That should have bothered him, but surprisingly, he began feeling something different: admiration. It was during this period of reflection that Richard made a discovery that would completely change his perspective on everything. One day, while searching for old documents in the company archives for a project, he found a folder containing personal papers that had belonged to his father. Among them was an old letter, dated over 30 years earlier. The letter was from a housekeeper named Dorothy, who had worked for the Bennett family when Richard was a child. In the letter, Dorothy thanked the family for the opportunity to teach Richard how to read and write when he struggled in school. Richard felt the world spin around him. He had completely forgotten about that difficult period in his childhood. His severe dyslexia had made learning extremely challenging, and it was the patient lessons of Dorothy, a simple but wise woman, that had helped him overcome his difficulties. The irony of the situation struck him like lightning. He who had looked down on the ordinary employees of the company owed his own education to one of them. Dorothy had been the person who believed in him when even the expensive private school teachers couldn't teach him. Richard spent the rest of the day rereading the letter and trying to recall more details from that time. He remembered Dorothy's endless patience, how she made him repeat lessons without ever losing her temper, how she celebrated every small progress he made. He also remembered how ashamed he had been of those lessons as he grew older, begging his parents not to tell anyone that a housekeeper had taught him to read. That shame had, over the years, turned into a compulsive need to prove his intellectual superiority. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how he had treated Emily, how he had looked down on someone who, just like Dorothy, was dedicating her life to helping others learn. The next day, Richard arrived early at the company and looked for Emily. He found her in the makeshift classroom, preparing materials for the day's lessons. "Emily," he called, his voice softer than usual. "Can I talk to you?" She looked up from her papers, surprised by the respectful tone he was using. "Of course, Mr. Bennett," she replied, gesturing to a chair. Richard sat down, something he had never done before in the presence of a cleaning staff member. He remained silent for a few moments, gathering the courage to say what he needed to say. "I wanted to tell you a story," he finally began, "about a boy who had a very hard time learning to read." Emily listened quietly as he told her about Dorothy and how a housekeeper had been responsible for his basic education. Richard spoke about his dyslexia, the shame he felt afterward, and how it had shaped his arrogant personality. "I spent my whole life trying to prove I was better than people like Dorothy," he confessed, "and like you. Because deep down I always knew I owed everything to her." Emily listened to the end without interrupting him. When he finished, they sat in silence for a few minutes. "Mr. Bennett," she finally said, "we all carry wounds from the past. What matters is not letting those wounds hurt others." "I know," Richard replied, "and I apologize for everything, for how I treated you, for the disrespect, for the arrogance. You didn't deserve any of it." Emily smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I accept your apology," she said, "but what matters now is what we do from here on out." At that moment, Richard made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. "I want you to be the new director of human development for the company," he said, "with a salary that matches the role and full autonomy to expand the educational programs." Emily looked at him in shock. "Mr. Bennett, Please," he interrupted. "How you have the education, the experience, and most importantly, you have something I lost a long time ago, the ability to see the value in every person." Emily considered the offer for a moment before responding. "I accept," she said, "but on one condition." "What is it?" "I'll keep cleaning my own office," she said with a smile, "so I never forget where I came from and remember that all work has dignity." Richard smiled back, feeling something he hadn't in years, genuine humility. In the months that followed, the transformation in the company was remarkable. Emily implemented educational programs that went beyond basic literacy, including vocational training and personal development. Productivity rose, workplace accidents dropped drastically, and the overall atmosphere became more harmonious. Richard, in turn, began actively participating in the programs. He discovered that teaching and learning alongside the employees made him feel more fulfilled than any million-dollar deal ever had. The highlight of the transformation came during the company's year-end dinner. Richard had prepared a special speech for the occasion. "I want to tell you all a story," he began, addressing the more than 100 employees present. "About a boy who almost gave up on learning because he thought he wasn't smart enough." He told his own story, about Dorothy, his struggles, and how pride had nearly kept him from recognizing the value of the extraordinary people working beside him. "Emily," he said, turning to her where she sat at the head table, "you didn't just teach me about humility. You reminded me of who I really am and who I can become." The audience applauded emotionally as Richard officially announced Emily as the new Director of Human Development. But the biggest surprise came next. "And so, I never forget this lesson," Richard continued. "I want to announce that I'll be available once a week to help with literacy classes, because I've learned that teaching is the purest form of learning." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us creators just starting out. Now, back to the story. The employees reacted with surprise and emotion. Seeing their once arrogant boss offering to teach side by side with them was something no one could have imagined. Emily stood to respond, her voice filled with emotion. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "Richard, what's happened here these past months proves that no one is beyond redemption. We can all change, learn, and grow. You gave me a second chance when I needed it most, and now you're giving that same opportunity to all of us." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. There were tears in the eyes of many employees, and Richard felt he had finally found a true purpose for his life. A year later, the company had become a national benchmark for social responsibility and employee education programs. Emily had established partnerships with local universities to offer affordable higher education courses, and several employees had already managed to graduate. Michael, who was now in his final year of high school with excellent grades, often volunteered to assist in the classes. The experience had taught him empathy and the value of education. "Dad," he said one day as they organized teaching materials together, "did you know Professor Emily is writing a book about adult education?" "I didn't," Richard replied, genuinely interested. "What's it about specifically?" "About how people's life experiences can be used as a foundation for learning," Michael explained. "She says adults learn best when they can connect new knowledge with their past experiences." Richard smiled, thinking how perfectly that applied to his own journey. "She's always been wise," he said. "I just took a while to see it." That same day, Richard received an unexpected call. It was a producer from a national television program who had heard about the company's transformation and wanted to do a feature on it. "I'm not sure it's a good idea," Richard told Emily when he mentioned the invitation. "I don't want this to turn into a marketing spectacle." "But it could inspire other companies to do the same," Emily replied, "and other people to believe it's never too late to change." Richard agreed, but insisted that Emily be the focus of the feature. After all, she was the true driving force behind the transformation. The segment aired 3 months later and had an impressive national impact. Dozens of companies reached out wanting to implement similar programs, and Emily began receiving invitations for speaking engagements and consulting work. "You're getting famous," Richard teased during one of their conversations. "It's not about fame," Emily replied. "It's about the chance to multiply what we're doing here." Then came an opportunity that would change everything again. The State University offered Emily a tenured professor position with the chance to create an extension program focused on corporate education. "It's your chance to return to academia," Richard said when she told him about the offer. "I know it's always been your dream." Emily was silent for a long moment before answering. "It was my dream," she finally said, "but I've realized my true purpose is different from what I imagined." "How so?" "At the university, I taught ancient literature to people who already had access to education," she explained. "Here, I'm helping people discover they're capable of so much more than they ever thought. That fulfills me in a way I've never felt before." Richard admired her even more. She was giving up academic prestige to continue work that truly transformed lives. "What if I told you there's a third option?" he asked. "What option?" Richard smiled before continuing. "What if we create our own institution, an adult education institute that combines the best of both worlds? You could maintain academic rigor, but apply it to educating people who never had opportunities." Emily's eyes lit up at the possibility. "You'd do that?" "Emily, you've completely changed my life," Richard replied. "It's the least I can do in return." And so the Dorothy Bennett Institute for Adult Education was born, named in honor of the housekeeper who had changed Richard's life decades earlier. Emily agreed to be the educational director, while Richard took charge of administrative and financial matters. The institute opened 2 years later in a modern building downtown. In its first year, it served over 300 adult students who had never had the opportunity to complete their basic education. At the opening ceremony, Richard made sure to speak about the importance of recognizing each person's worth, regardless of their social or educational background. "This institute exists because a janitor taught me that true wealth isn't in what we possess, but in what we share," he said, moved. "And because I learned that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the people we least expect." Emily, in turn, spoke about second chances and how every person carries within them a potential just waiting for the right opportunity to flourish. Mrs. Margaret, Richard's mother, was present at the ceremony and approached him afterward. "Your father would be proud," she said, holding her son's hand. "You finally understood what he always tried to teach you about treating people with dignity." Richard hugged his mother, feeling he had finally found peace with himself. 5 years after the institute's opening, Richard was in his office when he received an unexpected visitor. It was Michael, now a graduate in education and working as the institute's educational coordinator. "Dad," Michael said, "I have some news for you." "What news?" "Professor Emily has been nominated for the National Education Award," Michael announced, beaming, "for everything she's done here over the past few years." Richard smiled, his chest swelling with pride for his friend and mentor. "She deserves all the recognition in the world," he said, "and then some." "There's something else," Michael continued. "The Institute received an anonymous donation of $5 million to expand our work." Richard raised an eyebrow, curious. Anonymous donation. Michael grinned, knowing full well who had made the donation, but respecting his father's wish to remain anonymous. "It seems there are people out there who believe in what we're doing," he said diplomatically. That afternoon, Richard found Emily in the Institute's library, surrounded by books and plans for the new courses that would be offered with the expansion. "I hear we have a mysterious benefactor," Emily remarked with a sly smile. "The world is full of generous people," Richard replied, feigning innocence. They laughed together, their genuine and deep friendship having grown over the years. "Richard," Emily said, turning serious, "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For giving me the chance to discover my true purpose," she answered. "When I lost my husband and had to start over from scratch, I thought my life was over. But I found that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters." Richard nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You saved me from myself." Just then, one of the Institute's students entered the library. It was Mrs. Johnson, a 68-year-old woman who had only learned to read 2 years earlier and was now completing her high school education. "Professor Emily," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice trembling, "I just got the confirmation. I passed the entrance exam." Emily quickly stood and embraced her student, both of them crying with emotion. "I knew you could do it," Emily said. "I always knew." Richard watched the scene with a full heart. It was living proof that it's never too late to dream and that everyone has the potential to surprise. Mrs. Johnson turned to Richard. "Mr. Richard, thank you," she said. "If it weren't for the Institute, I never would have imagined I could enter a university at 68. "The credit is all yours, Mrs. Johnson," Richard replied. "You were the one who had the courage to believe in yourself." After Mrs. Johnson left, Richard and Emily sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. "You know," Richard finally said, "when I handed you that first Latin card, I thought I was testing your ignorance." "And you were," Emily answered with a smile, "but you ended up testing your own." They laughed again, the memory of their first meeting now a source of humor rather than embarrassment. "Emily," Richard said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Do you regret anything? Missing the chance to be a famous university professor? Going through everything you've been through?" Emily thought for a long moment before answering. "No," she said finally, "because everything I went through brought me here, and here is exactly where I need to be." Richard smiled, admiring once more the wisdom and strength of this extraordinary woman. "And you?" Emily asked. "Do you regret anything?" "Just one thing," Richard replied. "Taking so long to learn how to truly see people." That evening, as they walked together through the halls of the institute they had built, Richard reflected on how completely his life had changed. From an arrogant, prejudiced businessman, he had become someone who found purpose in serving others. The most important lesson he had learned was that true greatness doesn't lie in feeling superior to others, but in helping them discover their own. Emily, in turn, had discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to find your true home. The Institute wasn't just her work, it was her family, her legacy, and her way of honoring the memory of the husband she had lost. On the last day of the school year, the Institute held a graduation ceremony for the students who had completed their high school education. There were 57 of them, ranging in age from 18 to 75, each with their own story of perseverance. Richard was invited to give the commencement speech. He stepped onto the stage nervous, but determined to share the most important message of his life. "Dear graduates," he began, "you're here today because you had the courage to believe it's never too late to learn and grow. But I want to tell you about someone who taught me that same lesson." He told the story of how he met Emily, how she had challenged and transformed him, and how together they had discovered that education is the most powerful tool for changing lives. "When I handed that Latin card to Professor Emily," he said, pointing to her in the front row, "I thought I was proving my superiority. In truth, I was about to receive the greatest lesson in humility of my life." The audience laughed, but Richard continued in a more serious tone. "Each of you graduating today proves there are no limits to human learning. Some of you began reading at 60. Others discovered talents you never knew you had. All of you have shown that age is just a number and that dreams don't expire." Emotion filled the auditorium as Richard finished his speech. "The future belongs to you," he said, "not because you're young, but because you never stopped believing in yourselves." After the ceremony, Richard and Emily met in the Institute's garden. It was a clear night with stars shining overhead. "Thank you for the speech," Emily said. "It was perfect." "I learned from the best," Richard replied. They walked in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the peace of the night and reflecting on everything they had achieved together. "Richard," Emily finally said, "you know that first day when you showed me the Latin card, I almost didn't respond. Why?" "Because I was tired of proving my worth to people who had already decided I was nothing," she explained. "But something told me not to give up. Maybe it was the memory of my husband, who always encouraged me to fight for my dreams." Richard felt a lump in his throat, imagining how many times Emily had been underestimated because of her social standing. "I'm glad you decided to respond," he said. "Otherwise, I would have missed the chance to meet one of the most extraordinary people in my life. And I would have missed the chance to discover that some people can truly change," Emily replied. At that moment, Michael approached them, carrying a folder of documents. "Dad, Professor Emily," he said, "I have the final numbers for the school year." "And?" Richard asked. "We had a 92% completion rate," Michael announced proudly, "and 80% of our graduates have already found jobs or been accepted into higher education programs." Richard and Emily exchanged glances, both moved by the results. "This means we're really making a difference," Emily said. "It means Dorothy would be proud," Richard replied, remembering the maid who had taught him to read decades ago. In the following months, the Institute continued to grow and evolve. Emily implemented new programs, including vocational training courses and personal development workshops. Richard in turn established partnerships with local businesses to secure job opportunities for graduates. The story of the Institute and Richard's transformation gained even more recognition when Emily published her book on adult education. The book became a reference in the field and was adopted by universities across the country. During the book launch, Richard was invited to speak about his experience as a businessman who had discovered the value of social education. "When I met Emily," he told an audience of educators and business leaders, "I thought success was only measured in dollars. Today I know true success is measured by the number of lives we positively touch." The audience applauded warmly, but Richard wasn't finished. "If there's one thing I want to make clear, it's that this transformation didn't happen overnight," he continued. It was a painful process of breaking down prejudices I didn't even know I had. But every moment of discomfort was worth it, because it led me to discover who I really am. After the event, a young businesswoman approached Richard. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "your story inspired me. I want to implement a similar program at my company. Where should I start?" Richard smiled, remembering how he himself had initially resisted the idea. "Start by listening to your employees," he replied. "Really listening. You might be surprised by what you discover." The young woman wrote down his words and walked away, clearly determined to make changes in her own company. "Another seed planted," Emily remarked, having observed the conversation. "You're the one who taught me that small gestures can lead to big transformations," Richard replied. 10 years after Richard and Emily first met, the Dorothy Bennett Institute for Adult Education had become the largest community education institution in the state. Over 3,000 people had been served by its programs, and many of them now worked as volunteers, helping other adults learn to read. Richard, now 42, had become a national leader in corporate social responsibility. He constantly received invitations to give lectures and consult, but he always made sure to share the credit with Emily. Emily, in turn, had become one of the most respected educators in the country. Her teaching method, based on valuing students' life experiences, was being studied at international universities. But for both of them, the greatest reward didn't come from public recognition. It came from the stories of transformation they witnessed daily at the Institute. Like old Bill, a former garbage collector who at 55 discovered his talent for math and was now an accountant at a mid-sized company. Or Mrs. Wilson, who at 60 learned to read and discovered a passion for literature, becoming one of the most dedicated volunteers in the Institute's library. Each story was proof that it's never too late to discover new talents and follow new paths. One autumn afternoon, Richard and Emily were organizing the Institute's historical archives when they found a photo of the first literacy class. It was a simple image with 20 smiling people posing in the makeshift classroom. "Remember those days?" Emily asked, looking at the photo fondly. "How could I forget?" Richard replied. "You turned an abandoned meeting room into 20 people's hope for a better life." "We turned it," Emily corrected. "You were the one who had the courage to admit you were wrong and join the project." Richard laughed, remembering how he had initially resisted the idea. "Admitting I was wrong was one of the hardest things I've ever done," he confessed, "but it was also one of the most freeing." They continued flipping through the archives, reviewing graduation photos, completion certificates, and thank you letters from former students. Each document told a story of perseverance and transformation. "Emily," Richard said suddenly, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you still miss your husband?" Emily smiled sadly before answering. "Every day," she said. "But I've learned that longing can be turned into purpose. Every life we help transform here is a way to honor his memory." Richard nodded, understanding the depth of what she had said. "He'd be proud of you," Richard said, "and Dorothy would be proud of you," Emily replied. That night, Richard returned home with a heart full of gratitude. His life had taken a completely different path than he'd imagined as a young man, but he couldn't have been more satisfied with the choices he'd made. Sarah was waiting in the living room, reading a book. At 40, she had become one of the Institute's biggest supporters, coordinating fundraising events and awareness campaigns. "How was your day?" she asked, looking up from her book. "We spent the afternoon organizing the archives," Richard replied, sitting beside her. "It's amazing to see everything we've built in such a short time." "You've built much more than an institute," Sarah said. "You've built a new way of seeing people." Richard hugged his wife, grateful to have someone who unconditionally supported him on this journey of transformation. "Sarah," he said, "do you regret marrying that arrogant man from years ago?" She laughed, stroking her husband's face. "No," she answered, "because that arrogant man turned into the generous, humble man sitting here with me now, and that transformation was worth the wait." The next morning, Richard arrived early at the Institute and found Emily in the library as usual. She was preparing a special lesson on classical literature for a group of advanced students. "Good morning, Professor," Richard greeted, using the title that had become natural between them. "Good morning, Director," replied Emily, playing with formality. They laughed, the closeness of a deep and respectful friendship having grown over the years. "Emily," said Richard, turning more serious, "I have some news to share." "What news?" "I received an offer to expand the institute to other cities," he announced. 5 mayors reached out wanting to implement the program in their respective cities. Emily's eyes sparkled at the possibility. "That's wonderful," she said. "It means we can help even more people." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "But it's going to take a lot of work and dedication. Are you willing to take on this challenge?" "Richard," Emily replied with a determined smile, "after everything we've been through together, you still need to ask." End of story. So, what did you think of this story of transformation and perseverance? Emily and Richard showed us that it's never too late for real change and that respect can blossom where there was once prejudice. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you the most, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one.